Hello and welcome back to the One Thing podcast, where we all get to usher in the new age of humanity beyond Homo sapiens, which we call Homo spiritus. And we do this by practicing dancing with the one thing that individuals, communities, and countries have yet to try en masse. And that one thing is the connection to our higher self part of ourselves, or our true self anatomy, that people call by all kinds of various names. Doesn't matter what you call it, but it does matter that you call it. And our prime directive above all else is to make and consistently and constantly return to the one thing, or this taut connection, day in and day out. Sometimes it's breath in and breath out. And it's our first step, really, in dealing with everything in our daily life, rather than viewing problems as things that we can solve separately from the one thing.
Quite true. And so, do you want me to say what we'll cover in this episode, or you want to say that?
Yeah, go for it. Either one.
Sure. Well, there are many varieties of dueling energies within us. And in this episode, we're going to focus on one of those, which is the victim-oppressor duel, because that duel that goes on inside us is is reflected in the outside world in dueling between people who are identified as oppressors and who identify as victims. And so, from the perspective of the one thing, if we try to fix the oppressor victim dynamics in the outer world while they're still raging inside of us, that's a losing proposition. It's just not going to happen. We're not going to be effective. So, as a first step in shifting those collective or cultural or societal or community dynamics or political dynamics, as a first step in shifting that, we're going to look at the internal version of that and how to end that dance inside ourselves with gentleness and kindness.
Yeah, nice. And sometimes I think that the victim oppressor, or we could also say victim tyrant or victim tormentor or victim abuser or victim perpetrator, those are all a similar dynamic. And that it may or may not be raging inside us. I mean, in certain times it might be, but it's a spectrum. It might be just under the surface. It might be gnawing at us, and it might be raging along that spectrum. But the bottom line is that David and I wanted to have this conversation because it's really the ultimate in taking self-responsibility, that we tend to the tug of war energies inside of us that are seemingly opposing, which do not allow us to have a center still point of peace. And therefore, that doesn't exist in the world. And it can't until more of us actually bring those warring, dueling, tug of warring energies in ourselves more to rest or peace. This is actually what true healing is. It's a release of the underpinnings that keep us from having access to our center and our peaceful state of being and our wholeness. So we thought we would just use this one duality piece about victim and oppressor, because we see it everywhere. We read it in books, we see it in shows. I mean, it's just everywhere. So, whether you have it going on inside of you now or not, if you notice it and it leaves you cold or breaks your heart, then there's some energy there that you get to tend to if you're willing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we're doing this episode more in the spirit of riffing off of each other rather than the structure that you're used to us doing these episodes with if you've been tuning into previous episodes. So, in kicking this off, I think I think maybe it would be helpful for us to share some of are versions of this victim oppressor dynamic that I've dealt with and deal with, and that you have dealt with and deal with
Yeah,
in the
sure.
context of mm, uh, uh, you know, uh,
I have a lot of examples. We could be here till midnight. So, yeah. Do you want to go first or you want me to go first?
no, go ahead. It's fine. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think that when we choose whether we choose to incarnate as a man or a woman, there are varying degrees of victim for each of us. And so as a woman, I can say that I notice more than maybe men do. I don't know if this is true or not. David, you can say when it's time for
Sure.
you. But there's an oppression that most women or many women feel that we have to work ourselves out of over a lifetime. And I think that in part that oppression, the programming of it involves things like unworthy and not enough, and that kind of flavor. So we have to, and when we say work with these dueling energies, they're seemingly opposite, right? So victim and oppressor are opposites, right? So we're offering, or we're asking for our higher presence, the one thing, to we are consciously aware of these dueling energies in us. And so we say, we invite our higher presence into the dueling energy and ask for the third transcendent energy of wholeness. And there are two kinds of duality process releases. One where it's really our own energy, and we're bringing that energy to rest in us because it's a programming that we have our energy invested into. And then there's energies that we see in the world that don't necessarily give us a trigger or a charge, but we know it's unjust or not right. And so we can also bring an energy that is brought into our awareness to rest. I would say that, I don't know, almost something like 80% of the energy that we feel in us isn't necessarily our own, but it's just what's in the collective consciousness. That is much easier to sort of settle out and release in us. When it doesn't easily go, it generally means that it's ours. So I can say that I have, when the tyrant, the energy of tyrant, which we've had in all of recorded history, and we currently have in our world today. I won't mention any names, but we have variations of tyrants and expressions of tyrants. And what I do with that when I see it, because I do have a charge about it, is that I go inside of myself and I ask, so where am I being oppressive to myself, and where am I being, like tyrant-like with myself? Because then I have to find that place in myself that has oppressive, abusive, tyrant energy, and the part of myself that has victim energy, right? And I look for that in my body. I find the place where I'm feeling it, where there's a tension or a contraction. And then I literally invite my higher self's light into that. And if there's anything else I need to do, I get that. I get integration guidance, or, any other kind of healing guidance. Sometimes I have to write it out. Sometimes I have to do a creative process, and get it out of me. But I'm looking for ultimately a third transcendent energy of wholeness that comes about between victim and tyrant. And that arrives by grace. And when I say grace, I mean it comes from the heart, the sacred heart of my higher self, which my own sacred heart is connected to. And it might come right away. It might come in a couple of hours from the time I did the work, or the next day. But it's a triad of energy, and the bottom two energies are the seemingly polar opposites. So in our case, victim, tyrant. And that becomes like the lead that we blaze through to become our new gold, which is the third transcendent energy of wholeness. And when I say that, it's like there's some representation of that energy, like compassion or acceptance, or some sort of elevated sacred energy that is inviting me into it, so that I don't have to stay like a ping pong ball between the victim tyrant duality. The last thing I'll say is that the tormentor, like a victim tormentor, human beings worry to the degree of tormenting themselves. And so I have had to work with that one quite a bit over my adult life, and I'm not free of it, but I'm certainly more liberated from it. And so these are just ideas to give you, like, the abuser is someone who is so mean to themselves inside their head that, we wouldn't even want anyone to know like how terrible we are to ourselves. Perpetrator is someone who perpetuates harm. So those are all just ways of navigating this particular duality so that we realize that it's in us and it's also in the world. And when we see it in the world, then we want to go internal to settle it. And when we have it in ourselves, it will, whatever work we do around it will automatically liberate aspects of the collective consciousness, ultimate in self-responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm I don't think that that there's a lot of difference at the macro level between men and women when it comes to these dynamics. I think that the difference is more in terms of where the what's identified as the tormentor or the oppressor. So, for example, I'll speak about myself, and hopefully in a way that's not only about me, but that also touches on what a lot of men deal with, which on the external level, somebody or some situation is identified by me as a tormentor that's getting in my way or interfering with my freedom or interfering with my success or my well-being, or my objectives, my goals, whatever that might be. And if I'm externally focused, which is a mistake, as a starting place. I mean, it's not a mistake across the boards. I've got to focus externally in terms of how I interact with the world. But if I think that all I have to do is fix that outer situation or vanquish that person or whatever the external is as a starting place, I'm actually under a spell. The internal version of oppression that I experience is that my ego or my inner critic is operating as though, and I'm allowing it to operate as though it's the boss or the tormentor of me. And um, for me, the key always is that when I have an emotional charge about a person or a situation or a cultural dynamic or whatever it might happen to be out there, if I have an emotional charge about that, then that emotional charge is meant to or designed to point me toward an inner tormenting that
Yes.
I am not addressing, I might not even be completely aware of, and I'm because of that, falling into this illusion that if I fix or vanquish the outer tormentor, I'm going to be just fine. Well,
Yeah.
that's how tyrants end up identifying the evil ones that and then rallying people around them who agree with them about who the external source of their collective suffering is, and then they're going to eradicate or contain or eliminate those bad guys out in the world. And that's the formula for war. That's the formula
Yeah.
for oppression. That's the formula for every ism there is. And so
Exactly.
the starting place isn't ignoring the outer situations or the outer individuals or ignoring whatever emotional charge I have about those people or those situations, but instead starting by using that emotional activation in me as a call to do some work inwardly The
Right.
the old you and I have talked about this over and over again. The old saw, the old line about you made me blank. You made me feel such and such. You made me do such and such. That's the ultimate in non-self responsibility. I don't
Yeah.
make anyone do anything. I may try. I may be responsible for having an intention to try to make someone do something, for sure. And I make choices that do have impacts on other people, but I'm not the boss of whether or not someone capitulates or gives in to me, right? I'm not the boss of
Right.
that.
Right. And this is why we advocate the one thing, because we humans haven't tried taking this level of self-responsibility. They haven't tried answering this call to alchemizing our own energetic polar, um, poling energies, dual energies, in order to affect the collective and tip the scales in favor or away from war and to peace. We just get ourselves all embroiled in how unjust and, terrible it is. And it isn't the way to energetically shift the world and the world happenings. And I would also say this isn't like a lifetime work. So when I recognize that there are things like this that are lifetime pieces of work or aspects of work, I have to be kind with myself about it, and I have to get more gentle with the process that I'm teaching myself and or asking myself to do, because otherwise it's too hard. And the way David was talking about, like our ego mind, it's there's such seduction in that part of ourselves. Oh no, come this way. You are so right. Your judgment is so right on the money. And I would just say, and all of us fall for this over and over, right? I would just say that to the degree that we're suffering, that part of our being is not right. It's the ultimate in being a victim and an abuser abused by letting our head run the show and not allowing our heart to be the one who's the primary driver, but
Mhm.
giving that, abdicating that to our head.
Right.
That's abuse. That's internal abuse. And so we look out into the world and we want people to be kinder, and we want there to be more peace, and we want the division to stop, and we want, all these things that we are aching for. We will only get there by each one of us doing whatever comes to our awareness at any given point in the day, or later if we need to put a bookmark on it and take care of it later. That's the only way to get there. That is the one thing that we've never ever tried, that we're being called to at this point in collective consciousness.
Right. Another form that this war and peace or the war and war duel plays out in me is when I recognize that I've done something that wasn't ideal, that was short of ideal, or I made a mistake, or things like that. Um, I I end up beating myself up for beating myself up if my ego's in charge. So instead of oops, I made a mistake, it's I really screwed up. I'm uh, a subhuman thing, and now I get to be beaten up internally for being less than perfect. And in the context or the framing that some people benefit from, where they're helping the wounded child that they once were, that's living inside them as adults, to heal and grow up. That kind of internal beat up is inner child abuse. We
It is.
can
It's
easily focus.
tyrannical.
It's tyrannical.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
of course, child abuse, outer child abuse, trafficking, sexual abuse, all of those things are utterly and completely and unconditionally unacceptable out in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And if I really am called to help deal with those outer situations effectively while I'm still in an internal state of inner child abuse, I'm not going to be as effective, anywhere near as effective as I might want in my highest intentions to be. And that's why this inner work around the victim perpetrator inside of ourselves, the victim oppressor dynamic inside of ourselves is such a crucial and non-negotiable starting place
Pivotal. Mhm.
for becoming more effectively empowered in dealing with unacceptable situations in the outer world.
Yeah, including, and this might ruffle a few, feathers or raise some hairs, but there's also a victim terrorist dynamic, which sort of falls in this similar framework to the degree that that we rail against any terrorism anywhere in the world, and most people do. We have to turn the view into ourselves and ask with gentleness and with kindness and with
Mhm.
self-compassion, where in me do I terrorize myself? And this would fall under the umbrella of things like allowing ourselves to run amok with fear, being programmed by fear, watching fearful things. And, there's a list, a long list there that we could point to, right? And so one of the things about being connected to our higher presence, this part of our anatomy that we cannot not be connected to, otherwise we don't have this life, is that's the part of us that teaches us how to not be um, uh, laser stunned. What's that gun that you get stunned by? Is it a
Taser, the
laser stun?
taser. It's a
The
taser.
taser. That we stop tasering ourselves in terror and in fear. That's yes, it's true that there is terror on the planet and parts of all kinds of places in the world. But it isn't the larger truth. And so for people who are having conversations like this, I consider it to be my job to, at the very least, notice it, send light to it, and then expand myself into the larger truth, because that's part of my job. That's part of my responsibility.
Yeah. And again, at the risk of our message getting lost, we're not denying that terrorism out in the world is occurring. We're
Correct.
not saying that terrorism is okay. It's occurring,
Correct.
and there's no way in any sane mind, in my judgment, that that should be acceptable, period.
Correct.
And
Yeah.
if I'm not dealing with the internal correlates to that external terrorism, I'm going to be impaired in my ability to follow whatever my calling happens to be to deal with that or to help make that outer situation better. The
At the very least, stop contributing to it. Yeah.
Sure. So there's this face of innocence, this I don't do that to myself delusion, which is really actually a form of self-righteousness. Um, and what we're saying that may be really upsetting to some people is that if I'm emotionally charged by an outer situation and I'm saying to myself, well, I don't do some version of that to myself that I need to deal with in me, that's a guaranteed setup or a guaranteed clue that I am doing it to myself. I may be doing it to myself in a different form than what I'm
Yes.
seeing out in the outer world. That often happens. But the notion that I don't do any version of that to myself, if I'm emotionally upset by an outer person or an outer situation or an outer dynamic, what we're saying is that's the ego's delusion perpetrating ignorance and victimization on us internally.
Right.
That's bitter
And the
medicine.
outer, yeah, it is bitter medicine. It is. The outer world is a dramatic expression of what David just said. More likely than not, it's a smaller version in ourselves. So it's very, it is a seduction for us to say, well, I don't do that. But there's a smaller version, and I will tell you that there are aspects of this energy, this kind of energy, that is tucked away in little cracks and crevices in our, in our old traumas and in our beliefs and in our family ancestral lineage. And just know that, and be willing to let it present itself to you. When you are aware of something, it's ready to be released. It's not trying to torture or torment you. Do it with as much grace and gentleness and kindness as you have access to. I would say to never try to do it without your connection to your higher presence, because that's where that energy actually has the capacity to alchemize the dueling energies, the tug of war energies. We've all seen people play tug of war, right? They're pulling really hard on one side and the other side's pulling really hard. And it's a fun game, but it's probably one of those games that is hidden in plain sight for a reason, for like something like this kind of higher consideration. So anyway, it's a lifelong path, and it's a worthy one because it changes the tapestry of life.
For sure. And I'll add one other version of this that I've caught myself doing more often than I would prefer to admit. And this is another example of something that I don't think is at all unique to me, which is I'm very capable of getting very self-righteous about non-self-responsible people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if I don't, if I forget to treat that self-righteousness as a call for me to peel away yet another layer of non-self responsibility inside myself, or to peel away another layer of my allowing myself to be a victim to my ego, and my ego's judgments about me, self-righteous judgments about me that move me out of being in a compassionate, gentle relationship with myself, then I'm missing the forest for the trees.
Yeah. Yeah. And I
So
think we all do. Yeah.
yeah, I think it's fairly universal, and I'm speaking for myself because that's who I can speak for. And I'm hoping that others who are listening to this episode are finding a parallel to that in themselves. And if you do, and you notice your ego or your inner critic is wanting to beat you up for the self-righteous beating up in your own mind of other people, that's the beating up of the beating up. And that's what needs to be intervened with gentleness and like you keep saying, Lori, and it's so important that it always bears repeating, extricating ourselves from that internal dueling and warring doesn't happen as long as I am allowing myself to be in the delusion that I'm separated from higher love and wisdom, from the one thing, from source, from, again, whatever your term for that happens to be. I can only heal those things in me through the assistance of a level of love and wisdom that is way beyond what my seemingly separated ego is ever going to be capable of providing to me.
Right. Exactly. I mean, if we're elevating ourselves from um, a third dimensional duality experience into a unity experience, which is, what is being talked about is what's happening. That unity comes from our higher presence. It does not come from our mind. And our mind is very good at hijacking our spiritual connection, making it seem like we're doing it the right way. But we're still disconnected from that higher part of ourselves, and we're on a hamster's wheel. So
Yes.
that's just one One thing to know.
Yeah. And I don't know, I'm ready to wrap this up. How about
Yeah,
you?
sure.
Closing
Yeah,
comments?
exactly.
So my closing comment is to share or reshare, if I've shared this before in some other episode, the UNICEF New Year's card that my family received when I was about 6 or 7 years old. And the message on the card went straight into the core of my being, even at that young age, in a way where I've never ever forgotten its wording. And I have an add on to the wording, but the wording of the card was the greater peace will only come after the smaller peace we make with each
Mm.
other. And my add on is that the smaller peace we make with each other will only come after the even smaller peace we make with ourselves.
Yes. And that's beautiful. I was going to actually say that the seemingly like it's easy for the mind to think this is hard work. And I'm not saying it's not hard work. It's tenacious, but it's harder to not do the work. But the thing that is most worth it is the peace, the bringing to rest and bringing to peace energies inside of ourselves that have been dueling for probably lifetimes, at least through our DNA. And then because that's now nature abhors a vacuum, because that's been released, there's a version of our wholeness and eternal love that fills that spot. And that's liberation. That's the rungs of the ladder to awakening and freedom and liberation and sovereignty. And that's why we are here as humans, in case you aren't aware of that. So peace is the key here.
Mhm. And so are we ready for my closing? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So we hope that this has been an illuminating episode for you. And if you find that it's been irritating or activating or that you have a defensive reaction to it, then that's just more wake-up calls to look at something inside yourself that might have been invisible or sidestepped up until now. And what we really would love to hear from you about is what your reactions to this episode are and other episodes that we've done and your suggestions for topics for future episodes. And you can do all of that, any of that input or feedback or questions you might have for us at our podcast's website, which is totpodcast.net, TOT podcast, all one word, totpodcast.net. And so we'd love for you to go there and leave your comments and questions. And as has become our habit, unless we get a topic request, we end our episodes not knowing what the next episode's topic is going to be. And we just allow higher love and wisdom to guide us before we do an episode about what the next one's going to be. So stay tuned and discover what the next episode is as we discover it. So in the meantime, be gentle and kind with yourself so that you can be gentle and kind and effective in the world, and go in peace.